Chapter 9, Organizing and Paying for Education. And this feels like it's a little bit more in my wheelhouse because I actually have a degree, a credential to be a superintendent. My doctoral program was actually in school administration, so I have a credential to be a superintendent or a principal or a business manager or any kind of administrator. And so we spent a lot of time in my doctoral program talking about this very thing, organizing and paying. So in my world, it's a little more fun to talk about than some of the previous chapters. Having said that, this is the cover picture on chapter 9. And again, because I'm old and crabby, but this is very disturbing to me that this is what organizing and paying education looks like. These authors, this is their cover picture. But they do a lot. In the end of the chapter, they will spend a lot of time telling you this is your job and you can decide what you do with it. So first, the learning outcomes describe the organizational structure of schools, and then the second, explain relationships of teachers and their principal. 3, describe the organization of education at the state level. And that's a little more clumsy because you don't know anything about that. You have a sense of school organization, but not state level stuff. And then 4, the key issues of equity and equality. And of course, these authors, that's their shtick all the way through this. Describe, number 5 is really interesting. The federal government is organized in the ways to influence education and schooling. And they'll tell you many times here that they have no legal authority, and the way they will persuade you is with money. How the federal government is organized in ways that influences education, and then appreciate politics, inherent part of education. So they do a whole thing for you to say that's your stick. Now, before you go on, this is a pretty good read here about what it costs. City school staffing get needed independent reviews. Very interesting read here. And so please take a moment. So let's get at it here. Let me take you over here. Yeah, that's financing. So how many are there? This is interesting. Public education, it's large. For example, fall 14, 55 million students entered elementary and schools, and that's public schools. Approximately $600 billion to educate those kids. And is it okay if you wonder where all that money goes? These authors don't think you should wonder. System efficient. It's necessary funds to be found. They must be spent wisely. Taxes is a big thing, and there's a theme all the way through here about that. But so with all the tax here, they can't do anything without your and my money. And so what are the efficiencies? And they talk a little bit about that in here. Nationwide problem easily since the beginning of the Great Recession of '08. And why that changed thing is because values, like things that are property tax, fell. So there was less money coming in. Deciding school budgets and this. Okay. Here they go right away, that historically, since the U.S. Constitution does not address education, the primary authority is given to the states. However, and these authors really like the however because they're really federalist and like that. In the past 60 years, the federal government has become directly involved. No Child Left Behind passed in '01, and has been a clear example of increasing federalism. And so these authors are really for a big federal government, a big central government to run the schools. Okay. Also describes later this chapter politics, accountability and stuff, and the political pressure. And when you start your chapter like this, they like that. This is their thing, and I think it's destroying public schools. But I digress, and you get to make your decision what you think will be the role. And you will be our leaders for years to come in our schools, and you'll impact that. Some of you, just by sheer math, are going to go on and be our leaders in our schools as superintendents, principals, all kinds of assistant superintendents, assistant principals, and have a direct impact on these things. And so heads up here that you're sitting here today, you don't think this is you. And I'm saying just sheer numbers, some of you are going to be in school leadership. It's just a fact. Okay, around the corner, long bus rides away. Unless the community is very small and remote, may have more school organized in the local agency. And so I start with you with that. This will be number 1. Is what is this? Make sure you know what that local agency is. But here it is: 55,000 and 14,000 school districts, approximately 140,000 school buildings, and that was their census from 14. So just get your head around that: 140,000 buildings where kids go to school. And this organization is a superintendent. School is governed by the board, and its day-to-day operations is led by the superintendent. So they govern. The superintendent doesn't govern. The board governs. The superintendent leads. Okay, your official hiring as a teacher will be done by the superintendent. Did you know that? They will sign this, but it has to be approved. In South Dakota, it has to be approved. Your contract has to be approved by the school board, and it has to be dissolved by the school board. But their chief operating officer is the superintendent. Okay, so he has his own district office, which houses an array of things. And here's one of the things that's going to challenge me in this. This is what's going to challenge me in this whole lesson, is how different schools are. From our small schools with 100 kids in the high school or less to our largest schools district like Sioux Falls, have vastly different organizations. So I apologize to you now. I'll be vacillating back and forth when talking about these, and it'll be a little bit of a challenge. So first of all, this is really quite interesting. Did you know this? Have common features, also different features. Like, for example, the 100 largest schools districts educate 45,000 students, and the smallest 2/3 of districts 2,500. And it carries through. It have less than 2,500, and it carries through in South Dakota. So it carries through in South Dakota like this. The same. So obviously what I did is I pulled a whole bunch of this together, and I don't know if you can quite see this, but the top one obviously is Sioux Falls. And one of the things you have to report every year is by grade. So that's how we're able to look down at the grades here. For example, Sioux Falls Public has 1,400 seniors from last year, which my son was one of them. And here is their kindergarten class. About 2,000. So they're going to have eventually another 600 kids move up through the system. And that's how they did it. Here's the fastest growing one, Harrisburg. Let me show you what they look like. They have only 170 seniors, but their kindergarten is 400, so more than double. So that's how they predict what they'll need in the future. Okay, so let's look at total numbers in these districts. The total K-12 in Sioux Falls is 24,000. The next closest is Rapid City at 13. And then from there, Aberdeen, Harrisburg, Watertown, all the way down. And what I did is I drew a line here about, this is about 16. So 81,000 kids in the top 16. And then I went from 17 down, all the way down to... I think I stopped at these smaller schools. Where did I go here? Oh, I did go clear down here, I think. But some of these down here are agencies, so let's see. It's about right here is about the last K-12. That all the way through. There are these, say for example, like Salem St. Mary's is only elementary, but here is one of the last, and this one isn't a K-12. Here's Freeman Academy is, but they get down to 60 in the whole school. 60 in the whole school. Okay, so if I went from there all the way up to where we stopped here, that's only 70,000. So these top 15 are educating 10,000 more kids than the bottom 150 districts. So that carries through. So that's why it's so different. Okay. And it's hard to teach that. So let's get back here of this. Many are common, but this down here really makes that challenges this to teach this. So first, the superintendent. Here I'm going to just give you that an organizational chart. And this is number 2. You talk about who that is. Districts are governed by a board, but they do the day-to-day. And I'm going to give you this chart, and this will be our first one here. I'm going to shrink just a little so I can get the whole thing on there. And here would be your first clip. And you put the organizational board in. So the local board governs, and then the superintendent is the operating officer, and then this is big school. Obviously, if you're in some of our smaller communities, you never heard of an assistant superintendent, but in a big school, and Sioux Falls has these positions. I'm not sure they call them assistant superintendents, but they function like that. The business manager, the HR person, curriculum person, and special ed. And there's a whole number of other ones, because every one of these in Sioux Falls then also has people under them. Okay, for example, here, the curriculum directors, library, staff development, those are lower yet than these assistant superintendents. I mean, the assistant to these people. And then below these curriculum people, here's the principal, the teachers, and then obviously the students. And same with here, there's programs that have heads of them under here. So this is one of the criticisms of our system, is what, you ever heard this term? They're so top heavy. So here is, other than obviously this group here, the teachers, nobody else on the chart teaches kids. Yet, obviously, they draw by far the biggest salaries. And so that's a constant criticism, and I know it used to bother my parents a lot, this top-heavy thing. There's your first one. That will be right here. Then the local board's supposed to be nonpartisan. That'll be number 4. That is a big joke. Okay. School boards are normally elected in nonpartisan elections. Board members may also be appointed by the mayor. That does not happen in South Dakota. This is what we do in South Dakota. Most often, teachers cannot serve on the board in the district they teach, but it's not uncommon to see them be on boards of other districts. Kind of awkward, but it happens. And the powers and duties of the superintendent, this is what their job is. I mean, powers and duties of the school board, they are to obtain the revenue, maintain the schools. And they don't actually do it, of course. They come up with policies to do these things. Purchase sites and buildings, build buildings. And again, they approve these things. They don't actually do it. They work through their CEO. And it's just like a board of directors on a big corporation. They have a chief officer that actually implements all this, as do they here in that structure. Workers admit and assign pupils to school, and mandatory and discretionary, and this will be you. Those two things there, and they come from over here, what those things are. I should have went here, and I'm going to... So here, this will be a long one, and this is why. First, the district's an organization, and then the organization of schools. And that one's a really long one, organization of schools. And then organization at the state level, and then a huge one on paying for schools, and then, of course, the feds. And don't forget the politics in here, and they do a big part of that. So it's long, and you're going to have to carry part of this or I'm going to have a 2.5-hour lecture. All right. So superintendent of schools, importance of leadership. I tried to hit that here. Elected by voters at times. That's what I'm going to give you. Number 5 is how yours gets there. How? We don't elect our superintendents in South Dakota, but there's another way we get our superintendents. So you ask somebody, look this up, or maybe you know, but how are the superintendents get to be the superintendents in your school? Okay, so it gives it to you right here. Okay, scratch that. Okay, responding to board, they respond to board members. They plan the budget, and this is the number one thing. When I was in grad school, my professor harped on this every day of the class, that you need to know the budget. You need to know money. The worst thing he said you can do is run the thing in the ditch to overspend your money. The only people that get to do that is the federal government. Everybody else has to live within their means. And school districts are no different. And generally, if you want to get fired as a superintendent, overspend, and you'll have a new job really quick. And then look at the long-term aspirations of it. So what is that important leadership? Strongly by the leadership at the Board of Education and superintendent. Mostly the superintendent. When I was in school, our professor did not like the idea of the board providing leadership. He said that's the soup's job. To excel at school, local authorities, board members, and superintendent must convince their communities that specified school programs are both needed and desirable, and that is the job of the superintendent, to keep those programs viable. Okay. So this is now, this below this here, the line relationships and staff relationships. This will now be number 5. You bring those in from here, right here, line relationships in here, and important organizational concept to keep in mind is the difference between line and staff. Works with a staff to carry out the district's program of education, and the teachers are included in that. Okay, we have central office staff and a new chief operating officer, so you will address those, and that'll be number 6. You put something in for those. Okay, and then we get into school expenditures. Approximately 2/3 of the budget is instruction, which includes teachers, and then this here, transportation, buildings, and other salaries are part of the budget, and I'm going to give you what this looks like. I'm going to slide this back where it belongs. And you get this. I'm just going to go that far. So 60%, almost 2/3. And you get that in there also. And then support services, and then other. But you can see the number one thing is payroll. And so when we talk about cutting the budget, really hard to impact it all down here. Where you impact it is salaries, is how many people are working there, whether it's teachers or support people. And when I was in grad school, the old professor said that's the least popular thing to do is to cut positions, whether it's teachers' aides or teachers, whatever it is. But if you're the superintendent, your job is to balance that budget, and so you have to find a way to do it. This intermediate unit here, I put this in here, and this will be number 7. And you tell me what we call them in South Dakota. And again, ask somebody, call somebody, go on the internet. But we have intermediate units, so once you see what they are, and they're kind of go between the state and the districts, and they provide school districts with things like it's like several districts go together and they provide like special ed services and vocational services for each other and stuff like that. Right here, provide special ed and vocational technical education, and that's how they do that. And what do we call those in South Dakota? Okay, and if you're not from South Dakota, what is your state? But my guess is you won't be able to find it there either, so you're best to look and act in South Dakota. But their whole deal is to function, is to collaborate and share services. And you are bringing it from here. Okay. Now, organization of the school. They have a lot of features in common, like classrooms, corridors, central offices, cafeteria, etc. But they're criticized for egg crate things. So this is your number 8. Is what does that mean? Egg crate thing. And schools and space in schools are organized similarly, self-contained. When Sioux Falls started building their high schools here, when they built Roosevelt, they went over and they built Washington to be a cookie cutter, be identical to it. So they're similar that way. Let me go look at this a little. Here is the building, the school organizational chart. And let's have a look at that. You're going to bring that in also. But this is obviously the principal is the center of this. School district above, the superintendent, assistant superintendents, a whole bunch of people. But in the building, and this is one of those times it deviates greatly from our small schools. It deviates greatly. So we go back to this. And these schools up here are run dramatically different than down here, because I said you get down in here where there's not even 100 kids in the program, they start to share a lot of these responsibilities. But you have like an assistant principal, a secretary. Our high schools in Sioux Falls have about 3 or 4 assistant principals. They may have an instructional specialist on staff. They have a site-based counselor that we'll get to. Resource teachers, counselors, all these support people, but this is what it looks like. Okay. So principal, assistant principal, department heads, I'm going to ask you to contribute to all of those. For example, this is on the test. The principal, by law, the principal is the authority at that school. And again, if you're from a small school, that doesn't make any sense to you. But in our big schools, that is the CFO of that building. That is the CEO of that building. He, she, mostly she now, is responsible. As it shows here, the principal is a she. They are responsible for the authority of that school building. Their responsibilities include leadership, community relations, supervision of staff, teacher selection and evaluation. This is a huge one. This is one of your main responsibilities too, if you are the principal, is you're hiring the teachers and evaluating them. And assistant principals get this generally, but you are going to bring that right here. And this is number 9. You start with this one, tell me what a school improvement process is, and then you address each of these. And don't do it yet. Let me walk through a few more of these and then come back and do this. Okay, principals, there's your school improvement. Assistant principals, serve assistant or vice principals, other administrators such as director of athletics. And that's what you can call them. Like, for example, one of the schools here, the person doesn't have a credential to be an assistant principal, so they call him the director of athletics, or a dean of students too doesn't need credential. Share the tasks of principal and provide additional communication teacher staff. Mostly, we were told in grad school, assistant superintendent or assistant principals are to dole out the punishment, and I used to say kill kids. We're the ones to suspend them. Assistant principals are the ones to put them in ISS, and that's what our assistant principals did all day long, was what we called process kids from that. And here's the department heads and learners, teachers, other professional roles, resource, instructional specialists, school support staff, school resource officers, all those, you come all the way down and give me something about each of those. That's number 9. Okay. So the next is innovations in school, and it's quite interesting. Year-round schools, they're 4-day a week, and as you know, my son goes to school at 4-day a week, staggered start times, and so I'm just giving that to you also here, and this will be number 10. You make something about each of these with an understanding of them. Okay. Then organization at the state level. And again, I'm going to clip this for you. Okay, and let's look at this. Obviously the voters, and then a draft of state constitution which to work from, and then who is that body that does that is the legislature. Then we have a state board of education, a chief school officer, and a department of education. And then on the side the governor has input, but the courts have more. Huge things in education have been run by the courts. And then this below the Department of Ed, of course, is all the school districts. So this connection is a little bit sketchy, to say the least. I'm going to do my best to explain the relationship between the State Department of Ed and the schools, but not sure. First of all, this will be our discussion. Should the school day be lengthened? And please do not respond until you have read this. Please do not respond until you have read this, but that will be our discussion. And I can't get the comments to come up here. And this will be our first here. Miss that. And this will be our discussion here. Should schools day be lengthened? There you go. Okay, and then the State Board of Education, a little bit sketchy here. Okay, so the State Board put a thing, what their thing is. This will be, where are we at? Number 11, what the State Board is. And they really have two responsibilities, a regulatory and an advisory. And there's a question on the test about which is which. And then go through that. How do you get on this? So here's what you get for us. For number 12, you find them, list the names of State Board in South Dakota. And again, you go on South Dakota's webpage. It's should be easy to find, but you'll find a list and make sure it's current. This is a changing thing, but the State Board has day-to-day oversight responsibility. So this, remember this term when talking about State Board of Ed. Legislators are policymakers for education, the chief state officer here, and I'm going to give you this one. Number 13 is the name of this person and what's their title. And again, make sure it's current. Don't find an old website that has somebody from the past. Make sure it's current. So what is the name of our current chief state school officer, and what is the title? What is the title of that person? And it's not, we call it something else in South Dakota. Okay. So here, this is the Department of Ed. Their responsibility is operation, and they're right here. Those in which State Department of Education Administrators, School and Service. They regulate, audit performance of state tests, big one, view and improvement plans, force restructuring of low-performing schools. That was No Child Left Behind. Developmental, directed at improving performance across the schools. Public relations. Increasingly important is the federal government has pressed for more accountability. They monitor. So what here is the role of these two? I got to keep looking. This is this was number 13. These two are number 14. Not who are they, but what is their role? State legislature and a governor. So you put those in there. Put a sentence or two about those to address those right there. And then let's get into the paying for. How do we pay? Well, you better have this first. $9.5. And it's this. 9% is federal, so why in the world they have so much influence? 45 state and 43 local. So when you talk about equity, and they kind of are going to go crazy on this here the next few things, but what it comes down to is, so even if your state is fluent, which a lot of states have overspent, and of course that's the thing with South Dakota, we're 100% solvent. We have an amendment to have a balanced budget, so we can't, by constitutional law, not spend more than we take in. So if we want to raise funding to the state, it has to come someplace where a number of states just simply raised it, had deficit spending, and now we're in a world of hurt. But what also, the bigger problem here is of equity of funding is this. Is locals. A lot of locals don't have the funding. Property values aren't what the others are, so it's harder to raise local money, so this goes down, and then sometimes they're not funded adequately. So we're going to make this, put this right here, we'll put it right at the top, and this is number 15, figure 9.1, 9.5 I mean. Okay. And then you get to look through this. Equity, adequacy, this. So these will be, this here will be number 16. And you'll get those from here. And also this Reform Act, what does that have to do with this? That also is here. Okay. So how much did they pay? And it's all tax money. And in my world, tax money is my money that they take without asking. And so, yes, I'm kind of for accountability, but it seems like it must be folks that don't care how much tax money they take. Clearly, systems of taxation are complicated. Each system are intricately independent networks. I'll let you look at that there. Mostly, I think it's here. Property taxes, I put that up here. You want to address that first from here, and that will be number 17. What is property? Based on the value of property, both real estate and personal. Okay, and here we just paid it on the real estate, what the thing is worth. So the advantages and disadvantages are here. Steady, regular, and I think there's a question on the test about that. Steady, regular revenues. It's fixed, means it's constant, because even if I move out of this house, somebody else moves in, they pay it. That's why it's fixed. Difficult to move to avoiding. Say, for example, I move out of this house. Can I just whine right now? Currently, we pay over $7,000 a year for our house annual property, just the property tax. It's the thing that we think will push it when we retire. We'll have to leave just because by then it'll be $10,000. It'll be eating too big a chunk of our retirement income. But if we move to an apartment, somebody's paying property tax on that apartment, and how do they recover that? They charge it to the renter, so it's hard to get away. Easy to identify taxpayers. A disadvantage negatively impacts, and like say that whoever wants to buy this house, we're going to say, by the way, the tax bill is really high on here. It might discourage business development because of that. Always this. And of course this potential here of significant equities. So this is one, is how they continue to raise ours is not the tax itself, just continue to raise the property value. So there is here, you're going to talk about that here, number 18 right there. And then these two here is number 19. A regressive and progressive tax. And progressive is a scale to ability for the taxpayer to pay. Regressive that affects low-income groups disproportionately. And this is very, very controversial. Okay. And what regressive means is, for example, a sales tax would be considered a regressive tax because somebody that's a low income spending 7% like we have here in Sioux Falls, 7% sales tax is disproportionate to their income versus somebody that makes $100,000 a year. And if that 7% affects them less, and yet both groups use the same amount of goods a lot of times, like food and those types of things. So you're going to talk about what those are, and then you get this in equities of tax, and that will be number 20. And these authors love this conversation. Okay. Harvard described because of schools' heavy dependence on property tax financing, enormous discrepancies in resource equality have built up because of located in rich and in poor communities. So if you're moving to a community, a lot of times you look at that. Is it a wealthy community where they're going to provide good school because half the funding comes from the locals? Or do you want to move downtown where the low-income housing is in our urban areas and deal with that? And per pupil expenditure is big. That's how we measure. Statistic that's also to make international comparisons. That's what it was. And the courts have had to get involved here. Here's a case. San Antonio versus school district versus Rodriguez, and it's all about keep in mind, U.S. Constitution does not mention education or any litigation has to be based on direct connection. So that's what's also about going to the Supreme Court is really you can make a case they have no constitutional authority to decide something on school funding. Why? Because they're not part of the Constitution. It's the state's responsibility. Then state aid, state source of revenues. And the discrepancy of funding between rich and poor, property tax problematic, constitutional, per pupil expenditure. So state aid, you get that first one, and that will be number 21. What is that term? 21, right there. And then state and income, sales and income taxes. State provides this amount. Local schools. So four main sources of tax revenue for states are sales, income, license, and miscellaneous things. Now, this doesn't just fund education. This that they're collecting from this has to support more than just schools. I mean, it has to do all their Medicare, Medicaid, all their taking care of the underprivileged, the elderly, all that. And again, in South Dakota, we balance that. We don't spend any more than we take in. So often we scream and cry and go crazy because something's not funded, but unlike the federal government, we're not going to spend it in the state unless we have the money. And to get the money, we have to raise it somehow. In other words, charge you more. Sales income taxes are lucrative sources of revenue for states. And you know, in South Dakota, we do not have a state income tax. Okay, don't start throwing things at me. But it's just a fact, and it's been tried to be passed many times, but we don't, and that's why we have such a low tax rate in South Dakota. That's why we're so lucrative for businesses. But there's a lot of people that disagree with that, and just go into school and say state income tax, and you'll have everybody telling you we should have one. And then here's the newest part: legalized gambling on casinos, riverboats, horse racing, lotteries. All are new sources, and what they're all called is sin taxes. They're sin taxes because, in my opinion, and I get to have it because I'm a professor, they're disproportionately applied because I don't do any of these things. And so whoever does this, any of these things, is feeding the system. Okay. So there's your state sales and per pupil expenditure. Right here, this will be number 22. It comes from right here. And here is the state thing, and it isn't real helpful, so I'm not going to clip this one, 9.6. But just see in South Dakota, it just gives you ranges. Look at this. This is really interesting. These states that are below, Minnesota is very high. I bet you they're on the high end of this. I don't know what Wyoming. I know they pay their teachers really well, and they got started when they first found coal and oil in Wyoming. I have relatives there that get part of that. And then you see over here, like New Jersey is gray, and Washington D.C. is the highest in the country. Have the poorest schools, poorest performing schools, but they have the highest per pupil as in Washington D.C. You see right there, but we are in this range, and that surprised me. I didn't think we'd be quite that high. Okay. Continue to insist that financial institutions or limitations are not excuse to not do what the state's constitution sets out to guarantee equal opportunity. Many states' education were knocked down by the courts, and state legislatures were directed to remedy the wrongs. So here you get to address these. This is number 22. A little bit about this, and I'll show you where that is from here, beyond the sin tax. Some of these others. So you go through here and say these other entrepreneurial efforts to fund education. And this is a big one. I was part of this when they want to bring a Coke machine in. If you take all the Pepsi out and just let us have Coke, they would give us a chunk of money in our school, give us all kinds of prizes for end of the year things, give us all kinds of shirts to give away, give us all kinds of free product for different parties. And of course, what they were after, and if what makes sense to you if you were in business, is to get people hooked on Coke, because a lot of us are lifelong pop drinkers. Why not get them started on your product at a very young age, as you see the little guy in the picture, so when he's 50 years old, he's still plinking the Coke machine. And that's a number of things like that. So you address that right there. And then state aid, equity of quality, foundation programs works. You get this also, number 23. And 20 is these three right here, and they come here from state aid, even all the way down to a revolt. And you read this: past 40 years, there have been a number of political initiatives by taxpayers to reduce their burden, especially the amount they pay in property taxes. And now you heard me whining about mine, because it's ridiculous for what we live in the neighborhood we live in, that pay that much. But I say to raise that, they don't have to raise the tax. They keep raising the assessed value, keep raising the value of the house. It's not the value I could get for my house if I sell it. It's a kind of an unobjective number that the city arrives at to charge you a tax, a property tax. Movement is called Taylor Revolt, and most dramatic since it's in California in '78 when it passed a ballot initiative. Prop 13 limited the constitutional amendment to property tax as a source of revenue. So that was a big one. Okay, so there you have that. And then the feds. What can they do for us? Oh, this is just the end of that. So the 10th Amendment, and these authors have to admit it has the state responsibility, and Fed is increasing involvement, and the term federalism comes here, the process of centralizing the power. And this will be number 24. Here. And this will be number 25, and don't do them yet, let me show you what we're going to do. Federalism is this centralization of power, and a lot of folks, more and more growing number in our country, believe that's what it should be. Power should be given just to one big central government. I got to just leave that lay there. I'm not going to have an opinion on that because it's one of those things that could cause me some headache with an opinion, but 10th Amendment is to the states, yet a constant thing of federalism. The two presidents ago passed this, had no legal authority to pass that. The federal government shouldn't regulate the education, but they did. And that was the beginning of it. And now the next president had to do something, and the next president has to do something to keep reauthorizing that. It was like the national security, and that was their thing. They said it was a national security issue to solve these social problems in the school by the feds, not the states. Okay, and they will talk about providing leadership, taking a bigger role in determining the direction in which education should be heading. So that in direct opposition to what it's supposed to be, but that's what's happening. And in your time, you'll see the feds completely regulate curriculum, processes, all kinds of things. They already have all kinds of roles. So smile and go along. This is interesting too about the role of the federal government. Here is that, did you know that they run and fund the DC public schools, as I just was whining and saying, some of the poorest performing ones in school and the highest per student spending. They don't mention that here, that they're poorest performing. Many of the schools in Native American reservations are financed and managed through BIA money, but they also get state money. Really interesting. Department of Interior. Defense is responsible for West Point. Did you know that? Okay, and funds of educational research, regional educational labs, another door in. So that's what that is. Then we go to this ESSA, Elementary Secondary Ed Act. Again, President Johnson and his war on poverty. Of all the social programs, here's another one. His first swing at schools, and said it was a matter of national security, was to increase success of poor and minority students. And here's what I say to you is, this problem is so much worse than it was in 65, and yet the feds have thrown billions and billions of dollars at this. How come it hasn't been corrected? If it is the function of more money, there wouldn't be such a thing as a poor or minority neighborhood anymore. But that was the thing that the feds will take care of it. And then this is what the president in 2002 said, I'm just following up on this. And this was the biggest, most intrusive thing ever in public schools by the federal government. And here's what it is. And you get to be part of this. Here's number 26, is you get to write a little bit about each of these. The achievement gap, highly qualified teachers, process, disaggregated, need of improvement, other requirements, impact, cost of living, and waivers. And this is all the impact of No Child Left Behind by the federal government that has no constitutional authority to regulate schools. But they did. Okay. And this is what it was supposed to do: improve scores of all students. Students who scored close to proficiency, safe harbors, improve, not at this district in need of improvement. And okay, so that's what that was. There's all your stuff. Okay. So here's federal aid. It starts out. This is the rest of the No Child Left Behind requirements. Annual testing of students, which you know and you've taken those. State report cards, and you should be able to go on any school district's website and find the report card, and the state should be able to find them on the state page too to see how they scored. Got to make available to parents. They have to make available, this is somewhat new too, that when you get your first job, I have to be able to look at what you're licensed to teach online and what levels you can, whether the teacher is teaching an emergency or not, and what degree of qualifications you have, and this. So No Child Left Behind said this all had to be involved also. Okay. Then this local control versus federalism, a unique feature of education in the States was local control. So this was the constitutional idea, local control. Belief that educational decisions should be made at the local level, and those days are gone, rather than state or national. And the rationale has been that people of the local level, including teachers and parents, know what's best for the students in their community. That was what the Constitution intended. As has been described in this chapter, the trending during the past 60 years has been towards more federalism. Big central federal government was the most ever towards centralization. No Child Left Behind, signed by President Bush. Those who have more federal and state involvement argue that education is the responsibility of society. Some more argue that national survival requires centralized policies and programs. And so the debate goes on, and it'll be a big part of your teaching career, but I assure you it'll keep trending towards federalism. And how we do that is we continue to offer money to do very specific things that we want you to do as feds, and you'll do it. Schools seem to be so desperate for money, there's nothing they won't do for money. So here's technology for school administrations. Extenders, this response to intervention. Used for computing and managing budgets, planning class schedules, student information systems, student data. Okay. First, here's the information for the school district. Teacher involved with politics is we're up to that. Okay, let's get to that because I don't want you to miss that. This is you. I'm not going to talk about this again because, well, just because. So you get to, I'm not going to influence you on this, so you get to deal with every one of these here. Interest groups, coalitions. I'm not going to make you do all those, but I would ask you to certainly read each one of these. So if you're going to be an activist and carry a sign and lose your professionalism, that you know what you're doing. And I could cite all kinds of cases of that, but if you're going to be an activist, you're going to want to know what this is about, so please read all this. There's questions on the test about this. So read about school politics, teachers and politician, classroom politics, when to talk to whom, sources of power, all these things here. Interest groups, coalitions, accountability, teacher accountability, all those things. Oh, we're up one here. Okay. Chapter 9, Financing and Paying for Education.